Hello all, and thank you for coming to my talk. I know there's lots of talks going on at the same time, so I'm very happy for people to be here listening to me instead of other people. I'm Gibran. I'm going to be talking about some of the PhD work I was doing at the University of Zurich with Frederick Guillaume. I'm now at the University of Edinburgh with Peter Keatley. I like to start off my theory talks with some definitions, and I'm going to continue that tradition here now. The first definition I'm going to give is for pleiotropy. Very generally, I'm going to say that pleiotropy is where one locus affects more than one trait. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to be talking about two traits. In comparison, when we talk about, some examples of that, are when we have a gene that creates a protein that's an enzyme, and it has two types of enzymatic reactions for different ligands or different substrates. Or when you have a gene that creates a transcription factor and that binds different transcription sites. As opposed to linkage, where you have two loci and they are physically connected on the same DNA chain, and they can affect the same trait or they can affect different traits. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be interested in linked loci that affect different traits. Now, how do they differ? Well, they differ in two main ways. One is in how they accumulate mutations. So when we talk about a pleiotropic locus, any mutation of that pleiotropic locus can have simultaneous effects on two traits or multiple traits. And those can be correlated or uncorrelated, but when you have mutations in linked loci, it requires two mutations to have effects on two traits. Seems simple enough. The other important difference is in how they're inherited. When you have a pleiotropic locus, the effects on the two traits get inherited together. That can also happen with linked loci, but that's dependent on how far the distance between the linked loci on the chromosome. And the further they are apart, the more that recombination can break up the allelic combinations that get inherited from one generation to the next. All right. So what do linkage and pleiotropy do? One is, of course, if there's allelic variation, it contributes to genetic variation. But more interestingly, it also contributes to genetic covariation between traits because the inheritance of those allelic effects can be inherited together from one generation to the next. Well, how much genetic covariation? Well, if we're interested to know that, we could go way back to an important paper by Landau where he gave some kind of prediction about that. For a particular set of assumptions for quantitative traits, he looked at what would be the equilibrium genetic covariation between two traits given some values, and his analytical predictions came up with this simple formula, which I'm just going to talk through, and I swear this is the only formula in the whole entire talk. In the numerator, we can see that there's four parameters that affect genetic covariation between traits. One is how much correlational selection there is on those two traits. One is how strong selection variance, which is how strong that selection is on those two traits. The next is mutation rate, how much input there is. And then there's mutation variance, which gives you a nice kind of average effect size. But this is the continuum of alleles model, so it's a bit different. And that's all divided by the genetic variance, which I don't have time to go into, but we can talk about if people are interested as well. Now, what he concluded in this paper, or one of the conclusions that he came to, was that the amount of genetic covariance you can get between traits with completely linked loci is equivalent to some lesser amount of pleiotropic loci. And what I found that a bit not exact enough, and I kind of wanted to look at what exactly were the equivalencies between linkage and pleiotropy, and that led me to my question of interest, which was how much do pleiotropic loci and linked loci differentially affect covariation between traits? And the way I went about doing that was setting up four different genetic architectures or genotype-phenotype models to test this. In all the models, what I had was 120 chromosomes and two traits, so that these are, again, polygenic or quantitative traits. And the difference between the pleiotropic and the linkage is in the pleiotropic architecture, on each chromosome you had one locus, and that locus had allelic effects that affected both traits. And in the linkage architectures, you had two loci on one chromosome, one affected one trait, one affected the other trait. The difference between the three different linkage architectures is what the distance was between those two loci on each chromosome. And I chose a distance of 1 centimorgan, which is kind of quite a lot of recombination, 0.1 centimorgans, which is kind of an average for one estimate for average in humans, and 0 centimorgans, which means that there's no recombination possible between alleles. I took this model and I simulated it in the individual-based forward-in-time genetic simulation software NEMO, which I modified specifically to allow for these kinds of genetic architectures to be modeled. And I did it with these kind of values here, 5,000 randomly mating diploid organisms, because I wanted to kind of avoid drift, and 5,000 seemed to be enough to do that. I had stabilizing or Gaussian selection on these individuals, so each individual its fitness was determined by how different its particular trait values were from how different they were from the optimum. And of course I used the genetic architectures that I mentioned with the parameters that come from Landé's expectations, which I expect that will somehow affect the genetic covariation between traits. So what did I find? Well, what you can see here is first that over the 10,000 generations, the populations go from very low genetic covariation up to some equilibrium value. They seem to level off. The two main things that you can take from this chart is one, when you have the pleiotropic architecture or the completely linked architecture, they have almost very similar, almost the exact same genetic covariance that they can maintain. The second thing I want you to notice is that when the distance between the two loci on a chromosome get further apart, then recombination can break up allelic combinations and it can't maintain the same level of genetic covariance. I didn't just stop at looking at genetic covariation, I also looked at genetic correlation, which is something we're usually more often looking at in populations, and it's just the covariance divided by the variance. And what I found in this case was that pleiotropy could maintain a slightly higher level of genetic correlation than it could even at the tightest linkage. And I just should mention, if you can see that dotted line there, that's the Landé expectations for completely linked loci from the equation that we saw before. So pleiotropy has higher genetic correlation but the same amount of covariation. That must mean that it has slightly lower genetic total variation that it can maintain compared to linkage, and that's exactly what we see here. There's some pretty good reasons for that I can talk about a bit later, but I don't really have time for because I have to talk about the parameter values that I went through. So the first one is correlational selection, and again, if you want to look on the right-hand side, when I lower the strength of correlational selection onto the traits, you can see that the genetic covariance goes down, then the total variance goes up, that makes sense, and then the genetic correlation goes down. But what's important, I want you to remember, is that the genetic correlation decreases in all the genetic architectures about the same. So it has about the same effect when you decrease the selectional correlation. We see something almost similar when we decrease the selection variance, which actually increases the selection strength. It has an inverse effect. We see a decrease in genetic covariance, and again, I just want you to show that we have a slight increase of genetic correlation, but it has a similar effect across all genetic architectures, so we don't see any differential effects yet. Then I skipped over and looked at mutational variance so that I can leave the punchline for the next slide. And what you see here is mutation variance. When you decrease it, it decreases genetic covariance and total variance, and has a similar effect in its decrease on genetic correlation, no matter what the genetic architecture is. And then I saw something different when I changed the mutation rate. So now, when I change the mutation rate, I decrease the mutation rate. I can see, again, we can see this drop in genetic covariance and the total variance, but it seems to be much larger. But what I want to point out, and what seems very salient here, is that in the genetic correlation, we see a huge drop only in the linkage architectures and not in pleiotropy. And again, I mean, we can think about how new mutations enter a population, how they might be more deleterious if they have to affect more traits, or we can think about how linkage requires more mutations to enter into a population to get the same kind of covariation and correlation that can be maintained. So, I don't want to complicate that even more, but I just wanted to go back to my main question and kind of give you a general answer to what I found, which is that pairs of linked loci affecting different traits can maintain similar levels of genetic covariance as pleiotropy, but only when we have high levels of mutation rate. At empirical levels, which we have seen, which are something much closer to 10 to the negative 10, when we find genetic correlations between traits, we would only expect those to be underlaid by pleiotropic loci and not by linked loci. And that is one of the implications that we detect, that we might find in some kind of association study like multi-trait GWAS. And that's one of the implications. So the other one that's kind of better known is that when you have tightly linked loci, you might see this correlations in an association study between a phenotype, but that might be connected to the linked loci and not the causal loci. The other thing is that I kind of mentioned before is that these high genetic correlations are expected to be the result of pleiotropy. So, great. We might be able to distinguish between pleiotropy and linkage. Who cares? Well, one of the reasons you might care is because theoretical expectations are useful for building predictive models. But the other is that we're in an age of gene editing, and it started in humans even. And if we're going to go ahead and start editing genes in humans, it's going to be very important for us to understand whether the genes we're editing are pleiotropically linked to other traits that we don't want to affect or not. With that, I'll thank my team at the Guillaume Group, and thank you. Yes.
Very interesting. What's the sensitivity to population size?
Yeah, so I did it at 500, and I did it at 50, and even at 500, you can see the difference at it. But of course, there's more stochasticity, so there's a lot more variance around the standard deviations.
But what's your intuition if we're 500,000? The difference would be even larger?
No, I don't think so. I think it levels out a little bit. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Oh, sorry.
Did you try a combination of Pleiotropy and linked loci? Right now you separate those.
Yeah, no. So that you could see whether the genetic correlations that we find are either from pleiotropy or linked loci. Is that what you mean?
No, perhaps that would be a reason to do it.
Yeah.
But perhaps there are synergistic effects between those things.
I didn't think of that.